Hi, I'm Sebastien Couture of the Epicenter podcast. I'm here in Basel, Switzerland for the very first edition of the Hyperledger Global Forum. It was a 4-day event organized by the Linux Foundation that gathered over 700 participants, from startups to developers and enterprise, all building applications on the technologies in the Hyperledger greenhouse. So while I was at the event, I had the opportunity to speak with community members, learn about what they're building, and how they're contributing to the tools and technologies in the Hyperledger family. Here's my conversation with Brian Behlendorf, Executive Director of the Hyperledger project.
I'm Brian Behlendorf. I'm Executive Director of Hyperledger, a project at the Linux Foundation. Hyperledger is a collaboration between a large number of different organizations, many of them for-profit companies, but quite a few nonprofits, government agencies, central banks even, but most importantly between developers to build a common portfolio of open source technologies focused on building distributed ledger and smart contract systems. And I use the word portfolio very carefully because it's not just about one project, one framework. We believe at this stage in the evolution of blockchain technology, it's really important to map the landscape of potential solutions to this kind of problem. And so we have projects like Hyperledger Fabric and Hyperledger Sawtooth that are out there in production use today, getting a lot of attention, both very generalized platforms, as well as other projects that are focused on certain use cases like Hyperledger Indy, very focused on distributed digital identity. It's really a family of related open source software projects to go out and do a lot of really amazing things. The glue that holds all these projects together is really the open source community that we've built. And we've inherited from the Linux Foundation really a template for how to build these communities, as well as tried to bring in some of the things that I learned helping build the Apache Software Foundation about how to really build open source communities right. So one of those is we all use the Apache license. And that means when an interesting idea comes out of one or somebody writes some interesting code on one project, it very easily can be brought to another project. We also have a technical steering committee that acts kind of like a Congress, if you will, kind of people from it's an elected group of 11 developers who kind of sit there and approve new projects, but then also review the existing projects and try to decide what's the right degree of kind of synchrony that we can get between these projects, whether it's common standards, whether it's a way of describing the differences between them, but also just, are we growing these projects? Are we recruiting new developers? They all follow a similar methodology in how the software is built. It's not built by a small team sitting in a single conference room at a single company, throwing things over the wall, once a month. No, this is all done very publicly with public issue trackers, public, mailing lists, with wikis, and a lot of conference calls too. A lot of this happens over phone, but always minuted and always kind of accessible to the next wave of developers and contributors who come in. What we're really trying to do with all these projects is make them into multi-stakeholder software platforms, so you can know that you can hire one company to build you a fabric-based network, as a bootstrap, as a proof of concept, and then you can continue with that company, or you can choose another company, or most importantly, since all these blockchain networks involve multiple companies, multiple parties, there's no such thing as a blockchain of one. You want to know that different companies can hire different technology firms or even staff up their own technology staff to go and be a part of building these networks. And so that multi-stakeholderism, that making sure this is a broad movement, is really important to how we pull the community together. We see ourselves as kind of facilitating two different kinds of communities. So one of those communities are the developer communities, both developers who are just using the software. How do we make them the time that they can spend coming up to speed on a new toolkit like as easy as possible, right, as efficient as possible? So we create training materials. In fact, we're launching certification now for developers. All sorts of things to help them both get productive with it and climb the learning curve to eventually become core contributors, right? And it's a very gradual process. It's one where somebody doesn't just wake up and become a maintainer on Fabric, right? Even if they wanted to, they have to kind of understand, how does that team work? What is the roadmap? What are the things that need doing, right? And so facilitating that kind of engagement is one of the two things we do. But no one has to pay a dime for that. No one has to be a commercial organization and an official member of Hyperledger or pay any amount of money. It's all not only free open source code, but all of the development processes are public. And it doesn't matter if you work for IBM or Microsoft or Google or a tiny company, or you're a 15-year-old kid in Bucharest, who just wants to be a part of an open source project. You should be able to come in. The second tier of community we pulled together is the vendor community, right? And that is because we really believe you need people to be making money from open source software, not necessarily, like taking just the bits and charging money for it, although you can do that. You can follow a Red Hat style model where you sell support or packaging or that sort of thing. But a lot of companies are deploying this as cloud services. A lot of them are just using it to make themselves internally more efficient. And so we think we need to build a large constituency of companies who can say, this is commercially meaningful to us. So I always try to be honest. You don't have to join. I'm like the worst salesperson in the world, because to me, what's just as important as getting new official supporting members in is having companies involved in the community using the software and maybe even contributing back on a technical level. And I'm happy if that's all they ever do, because the code is really the most important thing in shipping out enterprise quality product, right? But for our members, for those 300 organizations who have joined and growing, we are really focused on helping them build their business on top of the technology. And there's a lot of different ways that plays out, whether it's by virtue of being a member. If you have a product or service that you resell based on Hyperledger technology, we'll put you in our vendor directory. If you're at a conference, a technical conference, and you want to help explain to your customers or to the people that you're meeting there, like that the blockchain platform you're building on is solid and robust, there are a lot of things we can do to help either be at that conference with you or pull together a set of other Hyperledger using members at that event, but let you wear a Hyperledger member badge at your booth. Whatever is going to help the world understand that what you're building on top of is a vendor neutral, open, and very powerful community. Lots of other ways this plays out. We're not very transactional about it. It's not like, hey, if you pay us this money, you get 3 press releases and a blog post. It's about building relationships. And we do have companies who join merely because they think what we're doing is important, merely because they want to make sure that this technology always remains multi-vendor, multi-stakeholder, neutral, the same way that the Linux operating system is, right? And for that, funding a core program office like we have is an important thing. So some are just happy to get the logo on the website and walk away. But for any degree of additional depth that a company wants to go into, we're happy to talk with them about ways we can help. So I think it's important because no software is an island. If we're aiming to be a platform, if we're aiming to be a layer of the stack of internet technologies out there, one that plays a key role in decentralizing, right? The solutions to certain problems. It's not likely that everything that's going to be built on top of us will be brand new, right? It's likely we'll be stepping into scenarios where somebody has built a centralized solution for something. And if we can be a way that they can easily, instead of writing to a central database, right, to calling into MySQL or something like that, instead calling into a Fabric network and, add 2 that ways to validate those transactions or whatever. But that way of taking an app that could only live on one customer premise or solve one company's needs and solve for that essentially a marketplace's needs or an ecosystem's needs is pretty cool, pretty compelling. And so I would consider it a sign of success if we started to see open source ERP software that's out there, other enterprise open source software that's out there as building on top of Hyperledger in some way. And really that wish list item was an attempt to try to see, well, what else is out there? What else do people think we should run? And then when it comes to building connections with other blockchain communities, this is far too young for us to think either we've solved all the problems that need solving or that other people won't find something new under the sun. There's just so much activity and so much investment that's gone in to communities, not just Bitcoin and Ethereum, but if EOS or Neo or Dfinity or others are able to come up with something novel and interesting, open source code is table stakes for all of these projects, right? It's something that everyone is doing. We might as well take advantage of that and learn from that and be kind of humble about about the challenges in front of us. And I think they'll hit us not so much in the use cases that we're targeting today and the projects that we're growing today. None of the production examples that I've been giving really necessarily require some of the things that have been driving the public ledger community. But what happens when that 12 or 20 network, bank network or supply chain network, 20 node, 12 node supply chain network grows to 1,000 nodes, right? That's where I think we'll start to see alternate consensus mechanisms, smart contract languages that are much more trustless in their operation, governance models that likewise push more into the algorithmic governance and less dependent upon human governance to sort things out. Like, that's where I think some of this space being pioneered by those communities will be instructive to us. So let's just keep our minds open. And then likewise, things like Hyperledger Ursa, which is the cryptography project that we launched, basically pulling the different cryptography routines out of Fabric and Indy and Sawtooth and trying to put it into a common place. Already we're seeing folks from Dfinity involved in that project. And look at, there's been a couple of famous instances out there of some of the public ledger communities getting the crypto wrong. Crypto is hard. Crypto, a project should be so lucky as to have a cert warning because that means people are looking at their code, right? All software has bugs, and it's a race to kind of close up the ones that you can find as quickly as you can. And the more compartmentalized you get, the more componentized you get, the easier it is to rigorously test and inspect and look for these kinds of defects. So I'm hoping that whether it's Ursa or other similar components that we're able to carve out of some of these frameworks, and that the other blockchain communities will find that useful. Yeah, well, we know that we have to become much more approachable. Somebody landing at the Hyperledger web page, should have an easier time of figuring out not only how do they start using the code, but how do they get involved in the community. Somebody landing at Rocket Chat and asking questions should have a better experience, kind of helping them down their path to deploying the code. We know we need to go out and reach out to students. And people kind of starting their developer journey, figuring out how to get in there with stuff that's simple enough and easy enough that they can get productive. A lot of face-to-face, a lot of finding ambassadors from our own community that we could send out to dev-focused conferences like AWS or Strata or these others, and building those bridges. That's all just a lot of pounding the pavement.